Thank you, Bill, and thank you, everyone, for spending the morning with us. And I want to just echo what John said, that this is a monumental day for the patient community in particular, to have this signal from the Center for Disease Devices and Radiologic Health, from Dr. Shuren as its leader, and from this collection of really diverse stakeholders that worked together for the past year to generate both the catalog and the framework, and to really give us a foothold in how we can begin to incorporate patients' voices in a rigorous science-based, evidence-based manner into the development of medical products and the regulatory decision-making around those products. And I'm going to ask my colleagues here from CDRH, each of them has just a few minutes of prepared remarks, and then we'll have a nice dialogue about the work that you've done, and particularly the guidance that was issued this morning that is a very exciting sort of third leg of the stool in the conversation about the products from today. So I believe, Katie, you were going to start? Great.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to MDIC for organizing this and including us, and congratulations to all the folks that were involved in developing the framework and the catalog. I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of the FDA people who were involved in developing the draft guidance that published this morning. As Kim said, we're very excited. I think this is a third leg of the stool for the initial work that's been done. I also wanted to take an audience poll and get a sense of who's in the room today, because I do think, that this really is an example of the kind of work that takes a really broad and diverse stakeholder group to accomplish. So who here is a patient or with a patient group? Okay, and industry? And government? And other? Quite a few. So it's really a nice mix there. Since I know there are some folks here who aren't actually primarily dealing in the device space, I thought I would just take a few moments to talk about what our universe looks like. So CDRH is responsible for regulating medical devices, and this ranges from the very simple, like blood pressure cuffs, to the extremely complex, like robotic surgical suites. And we do this with a cadre of over 1,500 medical doctors, engineers, statisticians, epidemiologists, and other professionals that work to evaluate the safety, effectiveness, and quality of these vast array of medical devices. There are over 5,000 different types of medical devices that we regulate. And so it's a real challenge to stay on the cutting edge of all of these fields of science and all of the rapid developments that go on. And so it really takes a concerted, multi-stakeholder approach to really stay at the cutting edge of those fields. And, there's really been a lot of exciting technological advances that impact the device space, from 3D printing to computer-brain interface technologies, to the increasing uptake of mobile apps and mobile communication methods in the healthcare space and the research settings. I think one of the things that Jeff did when he joined CDRH in 2009 was think about, how can we avoid getting too wound up in the complexity and the rapid evolution of technology in this space, and realign our focus on the patient. And so, as he mentioned this morning, our vision is really that patients in the U.S. will have access to high-quality, safe and effective devices of public health importance first in the world. And that applies, and that's sort of our guiding star, regardless of what discipline you're in, what specialty, what your background is. And I think it's also really a shared mission, regardless of whether you work for FDA, other parts of government, industry, patient groups, what have you. This is why we all get up in the morning and come to work each day. So it's really a shared mission, and I think it embodies sort of what brought us all together around this area that we're talking about today. So some of my colleagues got very nervous when I said I wanted to show people what a submission looks like. So we found the neatest, tidiest office we could. But what I wanted to get across here is this is one regulatory submission. This is one PMA. And an average reviewer will have 5, 10, 20, sometimes for our senior reviewers up to 30 different submissions on their desk at one time. And this is one application that they're responsible for reviewing. And of course, we have a multidisciplinary team that has the expertise to look at the evidence, but it's really a mountain of evidence that they're dealing with. And so one of the challenges and the reason why this benefit-risk framework that people keep talking about is so game-changing is that the challenge is really how do you structure the evidence and the data, and how do you structure your thinking in a way that we're all kind of talking, singing from the same score, that we're on the same page in terms of what the evidence actually shows, because there's just so much of it. And so, I think it's really an exercise of evaluating this evidence in the context so that we don't lose the forest for the trees. And this is really what the benefit-risk framework does. And one of the things that I think is applicable, whether you're talking about devices or drugs or other types of benefit-risk decision-making, is you have all these different ways and kinds of benefits to assess on one side of the scale, and all these different kinds of risks on the other side. But you don't weigh those benefits and risks in a vacuum. I mean, it's really about the context within which we're considering those benefits and risks. And I think, with the patient-focused drug development meetings that CDER has done, there's been a lot of emphasis on getting the patient input into that contextual framing. What do we know about the disease? What do we know about the alternatives that are currently available? And the patient is really the expert in those areas. They're the ones experiencing the disease or condition and the alternative treatments and the benefits and risks of those. And so for CDRH, we thought about, well, how can we take the patient input and actually assess their judgment of the benefits and risks when that information is available? So, Thelma was speaking a little bit more about the obesity study that you've heard a little about this morning. But, first we wanted to think about, for CDRH, what can we do to lay the groundwork in this space so that we can really be dealing with valid science and incorporate it into our benefit-risk decision-making. So we talked with patients, we talked with industry, we talked with scientists, we talked with a lot of FDA reviewers and managers inside of CDRH. We have an internal working group that meets very regularly, and we held a public workshop in September of 2013 to have some public dialogue around this. And so we looked at the matter from a variety of different perspectives. And this has been shown by a couple of previous speakers, including Jeff and Ross Jaffe. And I think what we use this to think about is the medical device product life cycle. One aspect that's unique for devices as compared to drugs, for instance, is that there really is an iteration process. You have the ability to take information you learned from some of the studies and preclinical and clinical studies and tinker with the device, to change it, to take this input into account and improve the technology as you learn more. And so, we heard from Diana from Medtronic that device industry is really pretty comfortable with getting patient input to inform at the design stage. Human factors aspect, what attributes are important to patients. But there's really a lot of opportunity to do more work to inform clinical trial designs and conduct, perhaps, with patient views on what's important and what challenges they face. And also the patient preference information, this is really the focus for today, can be incorporated into benefit-risk decision-making. I think all of this, regardless of what space you're talking about, really the biggest challenge and the most important thing for us to tackle next is really how are we communicating benefit and risk information to patients and healthcare professionals and decision makers in a way that's meaningful and scientifically valid. So these are just some of our building blocks. Jeff talked about this a little this morning. We're very excited for the MDIC framework and catalog, of course, which you heard lots about in the previous session. We're also excited that CDRH and the Center for Biologics have released a draft guidance which talks about how to consider collecting this information for regulatory purposes and how we'll consider it in our benefit-risk decision-making. One of the things that draft guidance, I know maybe you haven't had a chance to read the whole thing since it posted this morning. one of the things it includes is it proposes changes to the benefit risk framework worksheet, which is actually used by reviewers when they're going through the evidence in the submission and thinking about how to weigh the benefit and risk information. So it proposes changes to integrate the patient preference information directly into that decision-making process. So that's one of the things that we'd like comments from the public on, in addition to the general guidance overall. And then, of course, you'll hear some more about the obesity case study. I did include patient-reported outcomes on here. There's been some discussion in the previous session. I think this is an entirely additional field of study, not really the focus for today, but that is, part of the initiative that we're thinking of. So, I think just to reiterate that, patients really are kind of the calibration standard for how we're thinking about all of these things. And CDRH is really committed to integrating the patient input into our actual benefit risk decision-making process, but also throughout the total product life cycle where appropriate. And the MDIC work, along with the draft guidance, are some nice pieces of foundational groundwork in this field. There's much to do and much to discuss as we move forward to think about how to do this in a responsible and scientifically valid way. And all of us have a role to play in that next space. So thank you.
Now I'm going to give you a little taste of our so-called obesity study. First, I have to really thank Martin Ho that's here, because he's a big partner in this endeavor of, for several years and, months studying and talking, devising and working on that. So he deserves a lot of acknowledgement about that. But this study was what I call a proof of principle on how to incorporate patient preferences into our decision making. So when we started to think about that, we wanted to see how can it be done and how can we elicit patient preferences in a way that's representative and in a way that we can say that there are groups of patients that will really take some benefits in exchange of risks. From our experience in the FDA, as I said before, we saw patients coming to advisory panel meetings, giving them opinions, and the comments we usually heard is, oh, this is just a couple of patients, they are representing some kind of groups, they are representing the sponsor, they are representing the competitors, who are they representing? Are they real patients? Are they the ones that real represent our patients? And we didn't know about that. We wanted to know what real patients or majority of patients would think. So we decided at the time to conduct a study on devices to treat obesity, to explore how to elicit and how to incorporate the patient preferences into our decision making. And we chose obesity for several reasons, but also because the treatments involve difficult benefit-risk trade-offs. The decisions are, in this case, preference sensitive. The gastric band was the only device that was approved in the U.S. at that time, and there were broad arrays of potential devices with diverse benefit-risk profiles coming in the pipeline. We knew there were sponsors talking to us about these devices, and we didn't know how to evaluate that in a way that will incorporate patient preferences. So we use what we call discrete choice experiment design. That is one way of eliciting patient preferences. In the catalog that we just talked about, there are several other ways. This is just one illustration and one way that we chose. And the study in more details is published in a surgical endoscopy. So going back to treatment for obesity, they are all involving hard choices and wide range of benefit-risk trade-offs. There is the usual diet and exercise, everybody knows about that, low benefit, low risk, to the most extreme treatment that's gastrostomy have a high risk, you just reduce your stomach size, is irreversible, and you have a considerable benefit, but a lot of risk involved with that. And several others in between, including a drug that was approved, and we were talking about this study. So going back to the graph of risk and benefits, if you place them, all these treatments that were available at that time, you have low risk, low benefit, high risk, high benefit, something in between. And now let's see the sponsor submits to add a new device that has some kind of risk that's smaller than the highest risks. What would be the benefit that we would require for that particularly new device? So that's what we wanted to address. We were not thinking about a device specific because, as I said, we had several in the pipeline. We wanted to conduct a study that will encompass a lot of future devices. So we decided to sample obese subjects that were willing to lose weight. This survey was jointly developed by CDRH and RTI Health Solutions. They partnered with us and worked with us all the way. We sampled about 650 subjects with BMI greater than 30. And the survey was administered via the internet. The subjects using this experiment need to evaluate choices between pair of hypothetical weight loss devices that they are defined by their attributes and levels in the attributes. I will show you what I mean by that soon. Only weight loss devices were considered. We were not including the drugs. Here we were not including, other kinds of treatments, but the subjects will assume that the insurance will cover all costs in these cases. So we were not including the cost, the monetary cost for these devices. So these are, in summary, the attributes and levels that we consider. I must say that, this involved a lot of work to refine the number of attributes and the attributes that we were considering. It included, a whole division with the reviewers, clinicians, and engineers, and people that were used to review medical devices. So the attributes that were narrowed down were the type of operation that needed to be used to implant the devices. It was, in this case, laparoscopic, endoscopic, or open surgery. The average weight loss in percent, vary from 0 to 30% of the total body weight loss. Weight loss duration that vary from 0 to 5 years. Comorbidity improvement, 9 to 100%, and in that case we use, the amount of medication or the risk of developing diabetes, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure that are common comorbidities for obese patients. Duration of side effects that vary from 0 to 5 years. We know that some devices have permanent side effects. You can't eat certain foods or you get some kind of indigestion. So this is permanent. 5 years in this case was a surrogate for permanent. Chance of rehospitalization for treating adverse events and mortality risk that vary from 0 to 5%, and the diet restriction. So we had 3 levels for diet restriction: eat 1/4 cup at a time, wait 4 hours between meals, or you can't eat sweets or high to digest foods. Why did we choose that? Because we had some devices that had similar, not exactly the same, but similar diet restrictions. So this was an example of a choice question that a subject in our survey had to answer. They are faced with 2 devices, hypothetical devices based on these attributes, device A, device B. Each one has certain characteristics, and for this kind of choice, the patient had to choose one of them. Each of the subjects in our survey had to make 8 of these choices. As RTI will confirm, more than 8 is too much. They patients get tired, they don't pay attention. So ideally, 8 is the right number for these choices. So these are the results of our survey. These were the most important attributes. Mortality risk, of course, is very important. Weight loss and weight loss duration. These weights were rescaled in a scale from -10 to 10. The negative ones indicate bad things, the positive ones, good things, benefits. The larger the distance, -10 is the mortality risk at 5%. That's, of course, nobody wants to die. That's the worst. But weight loss and weight loss duration were very important. Risk of hospitalization for adverse event was the least important, surprisingly, because all these kinds of implantation require surgery. So coming back for fixing the device is almost considered like part of an initial surgery. It's like a follow-up on a surgery, so patients didn't care much about that. So what will be the results, the numerical results that we will get from such kind of surgery? We get the minimal acceptable benefit for a given risk. So, for instance, to accept a device associated with a mortality risk of 0.5%, an average respondent would expect certain combinations of weight loss and weight loss duration. For instance, 24% of body weight loss but for a duration of 24 months. If you lose less weight, you require more duration. For instance, for 18%, a patient will require that for 5 years. For 5 years is basically for life. Basically, they are assuming that they will remain with 18% less weight. An interesting product from our survey, and that's a product because the survey was a quantitative survey. We could get what we call a decision aid tool. What is it for? Okay, let's say we get a new device. A sponsor comes with an IDE. So they have a new device for which they think they will get certain kinds of risk. For instance, you have side effects that will last forever. For instance, you won't be able to eat pizza forever. Or you require surgery, a laparoscopic surgery, or you vomit in the first 2 months. So you enter in this tool all the adverse events and the risks, and the tool gives you what's the minimal benefit for that particular set of attributes. And the tool gives that for risk-averse patients, for risk-average patients, and for risk-tolerant patients. And the tool is also important because it gives you what's the percent of patients that will take that particular device. So you give you, for instance, 10% of obese patients will select this device instead of status quo. So as I said before, the decision tool calculates the minimum benefit patients will require for a treatment with a given mortality risk and other attributes, or you can reverse it and calculate the maximum risk patients will tolerate for a certain device that gives you certain benefit. The results are reported for several kinds of patients, so acknowledge the heterogeneity of the patient population, and the estimated values will inform clinicians in determination of the minimum clinically meaningful benefit. That's what Bill asked in the beginning, and we can use that value to size the clinical trial when the sponsor comes with a proposal for a device. So this is another result from the survey. You get a device A and a device B here with certain characteristics, and the tool can help you calculate what's the percent of patients who would accept the device. You can see the percentages are small, 9% of patients, but if you think about the obese population in the U.S., that's huge. If if you have a device for which 9% of patients will take it, is very relevant. It's a meaningful number, we would think. So the recent application in benefit risk determination, this is the Maestro system that was a vagus nerve stimulator indicated for weight loss treatment that was approved in early 2015, in January this year, and we consider that the estimated proportion of patients that will choose Maestro was instrumental in its approval, was relevant, so that was considered for this approval. This quantitative method, that's very important, can be adapted for other medical products, for example, for upper limb prosthesis. That's something that we are currently considering. And this is only one of the methods in the catalog. There's much more methods available. You can look the catalog now that's available from today on. Thank you very much. Now I invite Annie to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Talpa. We are very excited, as we've said multiple times, I think, at this point today, that the guidance is out, the draft guidance is out, and since we're assuming that you probably haven't had a chance to read the 30-something pages of it since this morning, I'll give you a bit of some information about what's in the guidance, and we'll be happy to chat about it as the rest of the session. So the guidance itself is patient preference information submission for both PMAs, HDEs, the humanitarian device exemptions. We included that, as well as de novo requests, and as well as talking about the labeling. And we address this to both industry and to other stakeholders, because we really recognize that this is, an entire stakeholder process. We want feedback, and we really think that's important for both industry to potentially do these studies when it's relevant, as well as patient groups, academics, and other stakeholders. And the rationales for doing so may be a bit different, whether you're on the industry sponsor side or a more patient group oriented side. So Ross kind of talked about it a bit in the last session for the industry perspective, that there could be a benefit in terms of doing these studies, being able to come in and have the same page when you're talking to FDA about your benefits, the risks, what are the relative attributes, and really being able to take that into account across the device life cycle, from your device development through your clinical trial design and into the post-market, into our benefit risk determinations and approvals, and into the post-market. And on the patient group perspective, we really see, we get the ad hoc, we've talked about this, you get the 1 or 2 patients, whether it's at an advisory committee meeting, et cetera, giving us their opinion, but really be able to harness your communities, use your communities, pull that information together. Your communities are heterogeneous, so get that information, be able to pull that into a way that's going to be valid scientific data that's going to be able to be representative of your patient populations. And we can use that information. Both sponsors can use it, FDA can use it, and we really see there's a huge value and huge potential for doing that. So there are 4 objectives of our draft guidance. So first, we've talked about, that Jeff spoke about this morning, is that this is voluntary. So the submission of patient preference information is voluntary. We go into then sort of talking about what are the recommended qualities that we would like to see in a patient preference study, and how that could then be constituted as potentially valid scientific evidence that we would use as part of our benefit risk assessments. Then we go into recommendations in terms of how you can collect that patient preference information, some of the various methodologies for doing that, as well, and then going into recommendations about the potential labeling, how to include this information in the labeling for both patients and healthcare professionals, so that if we are to approve a device, and it's Telba's example earlier, that 40% of the population versus the 60%, how do we best communicate that and ensure that patients and the providers understand that information and are able to use that? So you've seen this slide many times at this point. So I'm only going to hit on a few points. The version in the guidance was the one that Ross showed earlier that may be a test of visual acuity for some, so we apologize for that. And you can see across the sort of total product life cycle that really the point I want to hit on is that in the discovery ideation part, you're really talking more of the qualitative information. Then as you kind of move along the life cycle into the benefit risk determinations, that you're really going to be taking that quantitative, really needing those quantitative approaches. And certainly in terms of the clinical trial design, that's a huge area that we see that patient preference information is going to be part of. So we can have that information to know what the attributes are, as Telba just spoke about, knowing what those minimal clinical benefits are, as well as helping design your studies. This came up a lot in our workshop about if you design this trial around the patient so that you don't have them coming in 5 days a week in the morning and in the evening, that's really not going to be feasible. So if you design the study more around the patients, that can help with both recruiting, enrolling, and retention, which is a huge endeavor for both patients and sponsors to be able to get that, be able to do that. And then certainly in the benefit risk determinations, and then how we would use patient preference information across into the product launch and post-market monitoring. As we've said multiple times, the submission of patient preference information is voluntary. We'd be considering patient preference information as part of the totality of evidence, so including all the clinical, your non-clinical testing, and all those other data that a sponsor would be submitting as part of their package to FDA, as well as, and using that information as one piece of our benefit risk determination. And that this guidance does not in any way change our approval standards and doesn't change any of our standards for safety and effectiveness or create any extra burden on sponsors. And patient preference information isn't going to be relevant in all, or appropriate necessarily in all types of devices. If it's that high risk, low benefit sort of quad chart that you saw, that's really a no-brainer. We don't, patient preference information is probably not going to be necessary. If you're talking about a device like, surgical tools or something where it's really more important for what the surgeon prefers and how they're going to do it rather than the patient perspective, those are types of things where patient preference information is not necessarily going to be relevant or applicable. So really, we've talked about this, and you've heard a lot about the idea of the preference-sensitive decision. So patient preference information could really be useful in those areas where there are those trade-offs. You don't know, there are a lot of different options, and there's no clear-cut, this one's the winner, this one's the one you want to take, and there are a lot of different options with lots of different benefit-risk trade-offs. So we list out some examples of what we see as potential preference-sensitive decisions in the guidance. So areas where you have a device that has an interface directly with the patient, devices where you might have significant health or appearance benefits, if it directly is affecting your quality of life, life-saving but high-risk devices, as well as certainly unmet needs as well, or new novel areas where we may not have the experience or knowledge base on compared to things that are already out there. In terms of the recommended qualities we see for a patient preference study, so this, as we talked about, this is a nascent field, and there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the methodology. So we're not prescribing you need to use method A or method B or method C. Rather, these are the types of qualities we'd like to see in your patient preference study. And we looked at about 11 total, and I've sort of highlighted a few here that you've also heard quite a bit about today that really are going to be important when considering doing a patient preference study. So looking at ensuring that the study is representative and over across the population of a certain disease, that the study is heterogeneous, that you're covering all the different types of potential benefit balances that patients might have across the spectrum, trying to minimize cognitive bias, so being able to make sure you frame the questions in the survey in a way that is going to be understandable to the patient so you're able to elicit the patient preference information accordingly, as well as being able to make sure you're communicating what you mean by risks, benefits, uncertainties, harms, and all that in your survey or in your study to be able to make sure that the patients are really understanding that, and then making sure that your analysis is robust, you're following good clinical practices and those sorts of things that you would look for in any type of scientific study. So we encourage sponsors or any stakeholders, if you want to submit or do a patient preference study, come talk to us. We want to have these conversations, engage with you as to how the study might be able to be used in a regulatory context. And we also recognize that the specificity of the data is going to really depend on the questions you're asking, talked about in the framework and in other earlier today. And so we might be seeing different types of patient preference studies. Some might be really specific to an application or a specific device type, whereas some might be like the obesity study, which would be more of a disease or a condition or a broader sort of study type. And those could be we may be seeing that both within a submission or in published literature. In terms of communicating patient preference and labeling, this is an area we definitely would like feedback and comments on in our draft guidance that, it's been an area of discussion this whole day about and potentially next steps with MDIC and other stakeholders as to how we can make sure we're ensuring the best communication in the labeling and in other places to ensure that patients understand the risks and benefits. So if patient preference information was part of the benefit risk determination, we would like sponsors to include a plan for how that patient preference information should be communicated in the labeling. And then that labeling should include sort of the range of what the patient preference study was about in terms of the range of preferences, the characteristics of those patients, and what those characteristics were of those patients, so you can have an understanding of do you fit in that patient box or not, and then using terminology and numerical fields that are going to be easily understood and recognized. In terms of the applications to regulatory decision-making, we included a section on different types of hypothetical examples of how patient preference data could be used in benefit risk assessments. So a few of them are in terms of, we've talked about where the FDA reviewers may have a different perspective of what they think the benefits and risks are of a device compared to the patient community, so that information was useful for us to make a favorable benefit risk determination. And also a case where we looked at the patient preference data, but overall there was still significant risks to the devices, so that risk was now outweighed by the probable benefit, as well as the idea of patient preferences may also include caregivers and parents in cases of obviously pediatric devices, as well as mental impairments, et cetera. So an example of where we're talking about the parent or caregiver preferences. And as Katie had discussed earlier, we did include additional detail and sort of spelled out more in the factors in the benefit risk worksheet on those patient-centric factors, and would love to have comments on, do those make sense? Is that helpful? And how that can be incorporated into the benefit risk worksheet. And again, we're looking for feedback both on all the parts of the guidance, not just any one specific part. So please comment on the guidance. And we will also be working on training. So as we are going to get more of these studies, there's only so much that Telva and Martin can do. So we need to make sure that the rest of our reviewers and other folks within the center are able to, understand the studies. We do want to make sure if we're seeing them, because kind of Teresa's point earlier, make sure that we are able to scrutinize them, see what all the data and the underlying information within the study is to make sure that it is a valid study. So with that, thank you, and I will turn it over to Kim for moderating.
So Katie slipped me a copy of the guidance this morning, and while we were hearing about the catalog, I took a few minutes to flip through it. So I'm going to go off script and ask some questions of you guys that kind of relate to the guidance, but I think starting out with just this whole context for, Katie, you referred to them as the collaborative building blocks of really this program and this whole set of efforts that CDRH started with back with the first guidance in 2012, doing the Obesity Study, the Patient Preference Initiative workshop in 2013, partnering with MDIC for the catalog and the framework. And, what was the vision behind that? Was there a situation or a scenario that really brought it to the fore, and I'll look to Jeff maybe to add in here as well, that made your team say, we've got to have a better way to do this, and we need some tools to inform our processes and help the industry really, as you said, align the focus on the patient. Any one of you, including Jeff?
Yeah, I'll make some first comments. Jeff, feel free to chime in, and others. I think it's been an ongoing effort within the agency to better include patient views. We've had patient representatives, as you know, on our advisory committees for years and years now. That's one voice, and it's great to have that voice able to speak amongst the clinical and other experts that are advising the agency, and to have that patient expertise be part of that. But there's been increasing interest really on the part of patients to get more involved in the actual decision-making and have that voice be considered there. I think also going on at the same time have been some efforts within the agency to look at decision science and how we can incorporate that into our sort of qualitative subjective judgment around the concrete evidence that we receive, and how could we use that to maybe incorporate the patient preference information or the patient view in a way that is scientific and measurable. I think there's always a challenge with representativeness and heterogeneity, as we talked about, but I think it's a step in the right direction to be more representative of the patient views and inputs, and also to do it in a scientific way that we can really consider it as part of our regulatory decision making. But really, I think it's driven by the movement in the patient community to get involved in different ways in sort of the classic patient advocacy role, to really think about how can we leverage, there have been so many changes, not just in the mindset of the patient community, I think, but also in the tools that enable them to be involved in different ways. Internet, message boards, development of patient registries, patients actually going out and collecting their own health information to be used for research. And, I could go on and on. I think it's sort of a perfect storm for doing things a different way.
Absolutely.
I have a perspective from working at the FDA and being always faced with very difficult decisions. And we had all these kinds of devices that we get that, high risk, high benefit, or high risk, high benefit, and unmet medical need. And I could see the tension, the reviewers, sometimes they don't agree among themselves and the patients, and say the art of the science of decision making is very, very difficult. And you have to consider the context, not only benefits and risks, but there is a lot of other circumstances and factors that influence your decisions for the same kind of benefit and risk in one circumstance. You make a different decision than in the other one. So I think that's how probably came the benefit risk guidance. And as we work with the benefit risk guidance, say, where are the patients here? We need to hear their voices, and they might not be uniform voices. Nobody's average, actually. You have the risk tolerance. Who is average? I'm not average. Nobody's average. So you get the average, and you're above average. You're not representing anyone. We want to hear all voices. So I think that's how the whole movement started, and have to see that, Jeff is always enthusiastic about that. He's always saying, go and do it, that's a good idea, let's do it. And he makes us do it. He really makes us. So we all afraid, and we run and we do it what he tells us to do. So I think that's right.
And I just want to point out that all of this activity started without any policy mandate. You guys were out ahead of FDASIA. You were not required to do any of this under MDUFA, unlike Teresa, who had certain mandates under PDUFA and PDUFA. But what you've done is very much responsive to Section 1137 from FDASIA, that is, sort of outreach to look for more ways to incorporate patient perspectives into regulatory decision-making broadly. And I think it really sets a new tone for how do we do this in a rigorous, scientific, representative, reliable fashion. Yeah, sure.
I do think there are some things that are unique about device development and regulation that partially explains that. I think, for instance, as was mentioned by Diana, I think, the device industry thinks pretty proactively about what are the various inputs, including patient inputs, when they're doing their design. So we already kind of have a development I don't know that that would necessarily be the case for pharmaceutical development when you're looking at targets and things like that. And so, it's somewhat of a different universe to begin with, but we also have such a range of technologies where the patient really is a key decision maker, where in certain, pharmaceutical contexts that may be less so. You have direct patient interface with the device. They may be users of the device. They may have features that they can control. There are a lot of aspects of devices that really do lend themselves to more comprehensive and integrated incorporation of patient input throughout.
Much more of a human engineering context for that.
Yep.
Scott, do you want to? Let me let you have it.
Okay. So I work with in vitro diagnostics. I'm Robert Becker. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for in vitro diagnostics in OIR. We deal with laboratory tests and with radiologic devices. So I'll just comment briefly that it's easy to imagine that in vitro diagnostics or lab tests would not be something which is the natural growth for this mill, in that classically at least patients are not involved in having ordered their tests or in having applied the results. They would end up having the physician or the healthcare provider would order the test, and of course the healthcare provider would apply the results in the care of that patient, combining that result with many, many other sources of information. But this model is, I think, changing in important ways as time goes forward. One is that the devices are being put much more in the hands of the patients. You're looking at point of care testing where there might be interesting performance questions about one kind of a device versus another device in a use setting. And when the patient is actually involved in this, they have a significant stake in understanding what the benefit-risk trade-offs are. The second is that the devices are becoming much more specific in terms of a particular care outcome, a particular care course that might be undertaken with respect to the result from the device, no longer just having to necessarily always integrate it with a huge array of other information, and it's almost lost in terms of its real impact on the patient's care. Now we're looking at devices which can have very specific impact in terms of the patient's care and consequences that arise from that. And then lastly, you're looking at sometimes a very, very tight loop, and not necessarily running the device output, the diagnostic device output through the mind of a clinician for making the decision, but you might be looking at actual instrumentation in which that device output actually drives specifically what happens in an automated fashion with respect to that patient's next steps. So all of these things end up putting the in vitro diagnostic device, I think, much more in the realm of needing to understand these benefit-risk trade-offs from the perspective of the patient in terms of their involvement with the device and the impact that it will have for them.
Thank you. Scott?
Thank you. Scott Braithwaite, Professor of Medicine at NYU and past President of the Society for Medical Decision Making. It's really wonderful to see outlines for how labels may be constructed that take into consideration risks and benefits. So let's say I'm a patient and I'm thinking about whether to have a banding procedure, and I find out that there's a very good chance that I'll lose a substantial amount of weight, but there also is a good chance that I'll be in the hospital. And for some people, the benefits exceed the risks. Lots of people, when confronted with decisions like normative data, so for example, if out of 100 people, 9 would take the benefits for the risks rather than 70, that's something I would want to know, and I think that a lot of people would want to know. It's a roundabout way of making the case for, in addition to communicating as clearly as possible the preference categories for whom the product would be recommended, it would be useful to include that normative data, because I think patients would often expect it to be there if it weren't.
Amy, do you want to address that, since it's covered a bit in the guidance about the labeling features, which are a really, I think, novel, interesting thing to think about?
I'll take a first stab, and Annie, you should chime in if you want to add something. So I would say that what we have laid out in the draft guidance is really kind of a starting point, sort of a statement that I think it's important for us to communicate not just the benefit and risk information, but any preference study information that was done as important context. Now, how that would be done is going to be very specific to an individual device and the situation in terms of what is currently out there. So I think there's going to be a lot of devilish details for us to work out, and we're very interested in feedback on that portion in particular, and how we should be thinking about including this information, not just in labeling, but in other ways that we communicate with patients, for instance, in shared decision-making contexts. Randy, do you have that?
Okay, I'm going to take the last question because I don't want to stand between us and lunch too much longer. Katie and Annie, you both addressed the opportunity for patient organizations to develop these types of studies and make them available to CDRH. Outside the context of a product-specific decision, would that be something that they would approach you in advance and say, we're thinking of this and we'd like to get your input, or are you just looking to the literature as the source for that type of information when it doesn't fall within the context of a product application?
I would say both. Certainly, we welcome patient groups to come in and speak with us to talk about your study, what are the types of questions you're trying to answer. More likely, it'll probably be more related to a specific device, more device class type or a disease type, but where, the questions you're trying to answer, and as well as looking into peer-reviewed literature. This is an area certainly we see in terms of the collaboration with MDIC and other stakeholders, is maybe there can be some kind of repository of these patient preference studies, so that way it's accessible both to other patient groups or other sponsors as well, and really the entire community.
Great. Yeah, sure.
I think one place where it would be really valuable to see patient groups engage in driving the conduct of these studies is in looking at areas that maybe where innovation has stagnated or is challenged by lack of knowing what are the important benefits and risks from patient perspectives. I think, there are a lot of differences between the obesity study that was done compared to the work that John Bridges and Pat Furlong's group did in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But one thing that's in common is I think, there was innovation had kind of stagnated in both of those spaces, and I think there's great promise for just having some landmarks around what matters to patients that, who knows what that's going to do to the people who are thinking about how can we treat these diseases and care better for these patients.
And I can also see it being really beneficial where drugs and devices are part of the care, like in Parkinson's disease with deep brain stimulation devices and also medications, and what are the relative ratings of the outcomes that are possible with each of those. Well, again, on behalf of all of us who work together on this project, thank you so much for your active participation in that whole process. And Stephanie and Bill really helped us, and Ross. We met a lot. And you guys were always there at the table with active roles in the conversation and really helping shape the product. So thanks so much for your leadership, Jeff, and for the contributions that the whole team made to the process.